In the meantime, though, we're going to take you to today's perspective guest. And as we were talking about in the newspaper review around 5 or 10 minutes ago, today is marking the 50th anniversary of Portugal's Carnation Revolution, the military coup that put an end to Europe's longest-serving dictatorship and 13 years of colonial wars in Africa. The 1974 revolt, led by a group of idealist, left-leaning young military captains, quickly turned into a popular uprising as the troops were joined by jubilant crowds. It was a peaceful uprising, nicknamed the Carnation Revolution, after the flowers that protesters placed in the military's guns and tanks, in a rare example of a military coup staged to actually install democracy. Well, I'm joined here on set by Yves Léonard. He's professor and researcher at Sciences Po University here in Paris, author of numerous books on Portugal's modern history. He's recently published Salazar, a portrait of the enigmatic Portuguese dictator who governed Portugal with an iron fist until just a few years before the revolution. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us on the programme today. First of all, take us back to that historic day 50 years ago. What happened on that day and why was it so unique?
From the beginning, it was a military coup in order to end up the regime, the Salazarist regime. Well, at the beginning, the idea was to finish the colonial wars. It was the main idea. And in the meantime, the other idea is to create the conditions in order to install a democratic regime. But at the beginning, it was really to end the colonial wars. And the organization of this military coup is very precise, you know, with some captains, very well organized, with a strong feeling to remain very calm in order to avoid any blood situation. And the regime was not so well organized in front of the young captains. I mean, very early in the morning, you know, for the regime, it was impossible to finally to make something very organized in order to resist to this military coup, and in order to take the control of the radios of the principal ministries, the main ministries in the center of the city.
I mean, Salazar himself, he was no longer around in power at that point, but your book is an in-depth study of the man who embodied the dictatorship. You talk about a little-known, peculiar dictator, neither a military leader nor a charismatic leader, but an academic who was very uncomfortable in public. He certainly was a bit of a mystery, wasn't he? Who was Salazar, do you think?
Oh, Salazar was a professor. He was, above all, a professor at the University of Coimbra. And he was not a military man, no past for the war anyway. He had strong ideas, you know, he was a Catholic at the beginning, and he wanted to make a kind of counter-revolution in order to avoid any restoration of liberal meanings, you know, liberal political, liberal meanings. And he was very well organized, and of course, the support was the military, yes, but mainly the Catholic Church. Also, a political police, which was really important, the so-called PID, which was a very strong political police.
And what was Portugal like for the people that were living there at the time? Because in your book you quote, don't you, the French philosopher and the writer Simone de Beauvoir. She travelled to Portugal in 1945. She commented on the misery, the huge social divide. She said, "Those who eat do not care to change the fate of those who do not eat."
Yeah, the situation in Portugal was very difficult for the main part of the population. 1% of the population was living quite well, very well, and the other, it was impossible to live because the poverty was very, very huge, mainly in the north of Portugal with small villages, and it was very hard to live in Portugal at that time. And of course, for the regime, the main idea was to maintain this situation unchanged, you know, in order to make Portuguese live in a habitual way. But this way was not very sympathetic in political meanings, with no public liberties, freedom. Everything was controlled by Salazar and the propaganda, and it was really, really hard to live. And Salazar tried to avoid any change in this rural society in order to stay at the power. And
it's incredible that he managed to do that. You talked about the poverty. You talked as well about the fact that he wasn't particularly uncharismatic. So how did he do that?
Well, I think he was a professor. He tried to teach the nation. He was the great man of the nation, and with a narrative, a national narrative, which is very interesting in one way, because in a way to make Portugal great again at this time, in order to remain that kind of colonial empire, which was Portugal during the 16th century. But in the 19th and above all in the 20th century, the situation was really hard, And the idea of Salazar was to reinstore, to keep this idea very strong of a great country. And I think in one way, it was most of the elites of the regime, of course, agreed with Salazar, but some kind of people in the rural areas think that it was a good way in order to govern Portugal. But of course, the main thing for the regime was to be helped by a political police, and which was very, very hard, with prisons and justice, which was not, of course, a democratic justice. And the other point, which is very important to understand why this regime was so long, during more than 40 years, is because of the international situation. During the Second World War, Salazar was a clever man, in order to avoid the war in Portugal and to support Great Britain, because Great Britain was the old ally, there was an alliance which was very old. And after the Second World War, the chance of Salazar was the Cold War, because of his anti-communism.
And nowadays, a bit of a shadow perhaps looming over the commemorations. The far right have made a historic breakthrough in the legislative elections back in March, running 50 seats in the parliament. I mean, it's unprecedented, isn't it? How do you interpret that today with what happened 50 years ago?
It's something amazing, in one way, more 50 deputies of the far right. It's something very, very peculiar. Honestly, 3 years or 4 years ago, it was unbelievable, And this change was very, very quick. How to interpret this? I think there are some reasons. Of course, the problems of the democratic situation in Portugal, the problems of the representative regime, which is always the same all over Europe. But in Portugal, yes, I think there is a problem of not of nostalgia, saudosismo in Portugal, but the way the old regime, the Salazar regime, is seen by most people now in Portugal. I mean, young people, for instance. For young people, they don't know very well what was the dictatorship. And in one way, there is no will to get back to the ancient regime, but the way to create a situation of a Portugal which will be more respected in one way, a great Portugal, a narrative, national narrative, all that kind of stuff is, I think, for the young people is quite important. And on the other hand, you have, of course, the problem of identities, which is very, very strong all over Europe, and in Portugal it's the same. And that kind of leader of this far-right party is very, very habile, very clever guy, with the use of social medias and so on. And he's very, very, with young people around him.
So in the book, I mean, you claim that Salazarism is dead, but does it not show that perhaps it isn't with that turn back towards the far right?
Yes, in one way, maybe he's not completely dead because this man, you know, he was the professor of the nation and he was honest. And the problem of honesty, you know, is very, very important nowadays because you have so many kinds of cases of corruption. In Portugal, it was the main reason of the collapse of the government 5 months ago. And I think this image of Salazar as an honest man of state, it's quite important to understand the relationship with the past. But on the other hand, most people in Portugal do think that Salazar is a man of the past. And he didn't manage, he didn't understand the change of the world, and mainly the change of for the colonization and the colonial war. And the relationship is very, very, very tricky, you know. But I think this image of honesty is quite important to understand the situation nowadays.
So just finally and briefly, 50 years on, what do you think remains of the spirit of the Carnation Revolution?
Well, I think the spirit of freedom, above all, freedom, everything was possible at that time. And it was so important after nearly 50 years of dictatorship. So I think this is the main point. The second point is all the social changes in Portugal, which were allowed by the Carnation Revolution. Without the Carnation Revolution, it was impossible. And the third point, I think, is the evolution of the political, the external policy of Portugal. I mean, the choice of Europe, which was so important just after the Carnation Revolution. Without the Carnation Revolution, maybe it would have been different. But with the collapse of the colonial empire and with the choice of freedom, I think Europe was the only choice in order to reinforce the democracy in Portugal. And I think the link is very important.
Good to end on a nice positive note. Yves Léonard, thanks very much for coming in and joining us. Professor and researcher at Paris Sciences Po University. His book, Salazar, a portrait of the enigmatic Portuguese dictator who governed Portugal with an iron fist, as we were talking about. Thanks very much once again for coming and talking to us.